Dragged by the wrist across her own kitchen floor, Cora Bennett dug her heels into the boards and screamed for someone, anyone, to stop the men hauling her toward the door. Her fingers caught the edge of the table where she had fed her husband his last breakfast before the fever took him, and for one terrible moment she thought her arm might come out of its socket before the deputy finally let her go. "You'll not lay hands on me again," she said, breathless, backing against the wall with her skirts twisted around her legs. "I owe this town nothing. My Daniel paid every debt he had before he died." "Your Daniel," said the man standing in her doorway with the sun behind him, "owed the Grey Rock Land Company $400 against this house, ma'am, and the note's come due." Silas Marrow was the land agent's clerk, a soft, unhurried man who smiled the way snakes were said to smile, and he held out a paper as though it settled the matter simply by existing. "We've come to see the property vated peaceable. It needn't be ugly." "It's already ugly," Cora said. "You've had a man drag me by the arm across my own floor." "There's no note," she said again, straightening her spine though her whole body shook. "Daniel showed me the ledger himself before he passed. Every debt paid clear, every one. I signed nothing, and neither did he, for $400 nor for 4. "The company's records say otherwise," Marrow said, and behind him the deputy shifted his weight, plainly uneasy but plainly outnumbered by his own orders. "I'm sorry for it, truly, but a widow can't very well argue with paper." Cora's eyes swept the small kitchen that had been the whole of her world these 6 months since Daniel's passing, the quilt she'd stitched by lamplight during the long nights of his fever, the chipped blue pitcher that had been her mother's, the tin box of receipts she kept beneath a loose floorboard, because a woman alone learned quickly what things were worth guarding. She had buried her husband in the spring and spent the summer teaching herself the accounts he had always kept, determined that no one would ever say a Bennett left a debt unpaid. To be told now, with autumn coming on and her savings thin as they were, that all of it had been for nothing, that a paper she had never signed could undo 6 months of careful, grieving effort, it was more than fear. It was a particular kind of fury that only the truly wronged ever learn. It was then that a shadow fell across the doorway from the porch, long and unhurried, and a low voice said, "She can if the paper's a lie." Nash Ellery had ridden into Grey Rock only the evening before, meaning to rest his horse and be gone by noon, and he told himself even as he crossed the yard, toward the commotion at the widow Bennett's door, that it was none of his business what quarrel a land company clerk had with a grieving woman. He had learned, over 11 hard years of being paid, to point a gun where other men were too frightened to point their own, that a stranger who stepped into other folks' troubles usually stepped into a grave besides. But he had also learned, harder still, that a man who watched cruelty happen and called it none of his business was no better than the men doing the cruelty, and he had promised himself, the day he buried the last friend that particular lesson had cost him, that he would not be that kind of man again. So he stood in the doorway wide enough to fill it, and did not move. "This isn't your concern, Mr. Marrow said, though his voice had lost some of its oiled confidence. "Made it my concern the second I saw a man's hand on a widow's arm," Nash said. "Let's see this paper you're so sure of." Marrow hesitated, then passed it over with the air of a man humoring a fool who would soon see reason. Nash read it slow, the way he read everything, because a man who read too fast in his line of work often didn't live to finish the sentence. The signature at the bottom was cramped and unfamiliar, nothing like the bold, careful hand Cora had shown him not a minute before on a stack of paid receipts she kept in a tin box, every one of them signed in Daniel Bennett's plain, upright script. "This signature doesn't match hers," Nash said, holding up one of Cora's receipts beside the note. "Not the loops, not the slant, not the pressure of the pen. Any judge with eyes could see these weren't written by the same hand." "Forgeries happen," Marrow said, though sweat had begun to bead along his collar. "Doesn't mean the debt's not owed. Funny thing about forgeries," Nash said, "is somebody generally profits from them. Who holds the deed to this house, once the widow's put out of it?" Marrow's mouth opened and shut without producing an answer, and in that silence Cora felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the men first came pounding on her door that morning. "The railroad's buying every parcel along this stretch for the new spur line," she said slowly, understanding arriving all at once. the way it sometimes does after fear has cleared a space for thinking. Daniel's land sits square in the middle of the surveyed route. I heard the men talking of it at the Mercantile last month, though I never thought. She stopped, looking at Marrow with new and terrible clarity. You forged that note so the company could seize my home before the railroad ever came asking to buy it fair. That's a serious accusation, Marrow said, but he had gone pale, and the deputy beside him had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man realizing he had nearly done wrong on another man's word. It is, Nash agreed. Which is why we'll take this note and these receipts to the circuit judge when he rides through Friday, and let him decide whether Mrs. Bennet owes the Grey Rockland Company 1 red cent, or whether the Grey Rockland Company owes considerably more for the trouble. I'll not stand here and be threatened by a hired gun, Marrow said, some of his oil returning now that the shock had passed. I'm not threatening you, Nash said, and something in his voice went quieter and colder at once, the way still water goes colder the deeper it runs. I'm telling you plain what happens next. You and your deputy are going to walk off this porch, and you're going to leave this woman in her home until a judge with no stake in the railroad's spur line says otherwise. If you come back before Friday, you'll find me still standing in this doorway, and I promise you I'm considerably harder to move than a widow with nobody to stand behind her. For a long moment nobody moved at all. Then the deputy, who had a wife and 2 daughters of his own, and had never much cared for the errand he'd been sent on, touched Marrow's elbow. Let's go, Silas. This one's above my pay. They went, Marrow sputtering threats about company lawyers that grew fainter as he crossed the yard. And Cora Bennet sank into the chair by her cold stove and put her face in her hands, not weeping exactly, but shaking with the particular exhaustion of a fear that has finally, if only for the moment, been allowed to set down its burden. You didn't have to do that, she said when she trusted her voice again. You don't know me. You don't know if I'm telling the truth. I know a forged signature when I see one, Nash said, and I know the particular look of a man who's been caught lying and hasn't decided yet whether to brazen it out. Marrow had that look the whole time. He set his hat on the table, an oddly domestic gesture from a man who wore 2 pistols like other men wore suspenders. Besides, I've seen enough true things to know the shape of them, even in strangers. Cora studied him properly for the first time. The deep lines a hard life had carved around his eyes, the way he stood always a little sideways to a room, watching its corners out of old habit, the gentleness that sat strangely and yet not unnaturally on a man who made his living with a gun. Folks in town will say you're only after something, she said. A gunslinger doesn't step between a land company and a widow's house for nothing. Folks in town can say what they like, Nash said. I've been called worse than a man who minds other people's business. I'll ride on Friday after the judge has settled it proper, and you'll never have to see me again if that's your wish. But he did not ride on Friday, not really, not in any way that mattered. He spent the days between sitting on Cora's porch of an evening while she worked her needle, and he cleaned a rifle he had no urgent need to clean, and somewhere in those quiet hours, without either of them quite naming it, something took root between a woman who had believed herself entirely alone in the world and a man who had believed himself unfit for anything but violence and leaving. She told him of Daniel, of the good, plain years of their marriage, of the fever that had taken him too fast for either of them to prepare, of the long nights afterward when she had lain awake certain she would lose the house too, and with it the lost piece of a life she had loved. He listened the way few men had ever listened to her, without impatience, without waiting for his turn to speak, and something in Cora unclenched that had been wound tight since the day of the funeral. In turn he told her, slowly, in pieces that cost him visibly to give up, of the friend he'd buried on a dusty road to east, a young deputy who had begged him to help stand against a crooked cattle baron and whom Nash had refused, telling himself it was none of his affair, only to find the boy dead in a ditch a week later for having stood alone. He had sworn over that grave that he would never again watch cruelty pass and call it someone else's business, and he told Cora, quietly, that he had kept that promise exactly twice in 6 years. And that watching a widow defend her home with nothing but a tin box of receipts and her own stubborn certainty had reminded him why the promise had mattered in the first place. You make it sound a small thing, Cora said one evening, standing in a doorway. It's the smallest thing in the world, Nash said, right up until it's the only thing standing between a person and ruin. Then it's the only thing that matters at all. Friday came grey and threatening rain, and half of Grey Rock turned out at the little courthouse to watch the circuit judge examine the disputed note. Marrow's employer, a heavyset man named Aldous Reed who ran the land company from an office 2 towns over, arrived with a lawyer and a great deal of blustering confidence that dissolved the moment the judge laid Cora's receipts and the forged note side beneath a magnifying glass. This signature was traced, the judge said flatly, after a silence that stretched long enough for Marrow to go the color of old ash. Traced from an old receipt, if I don't miss my guess, over a lamp glass or a window pane. Poorly enough that any clerk with eyes should have caught it before it ever reached my bench. He fixed Marrow with a look that promised considerably more trouble than a scolding. "Mr. Marrow, you'll answer for this note in a criminal court, not a civil one. Mrs. Bennett owes the Grey Rock Land Company nothing, and I'd advise Mr. Reed to consider whether he wishes his railroad's name attached any further to this matter." Reed did not wish it. He settled with Cora before the week was out, a sum for the inconvenience and the fright that was, Nash observed dryly, considerably more than $400, and rode out of Grey Rock never to trouble her again. That evening Cora stood on her porch in the last grey light, watching Nash check the cinch on his horse with the careful unhurried movements of a man about to do something he'd rather not do, and felt her heart go tight and small in her chest. "You'll be riding on now," she said, keeping her voice steady with some effort. "The trouble's settled. You've no more reason to stay." Nash's hands stilled on the leather. "I've been telling myself the same thing 3 days running," he admitted, "and finding I don't much believe it." He turned to face her fully, hat in his hand, the gunslinger's easy stillness gone entirely out of him, and something rawer standing in its place. "I've spent 11 years being paid to leave places the moment the trouble in them was done. I find I don't want to leave this one, Cora, trouble or no trouble. I don't know that I've got much to offer a woman besides a steady hand and a promise I mean to keep, but I'd like the chance to offer it anyway, if you'll have it." Cora crossed the porch to him, the same porch where a stranger had once stood in her doorway and refused to let cruelty pass, and put her hand against his chest where she could feel his heart going as unsteady as her own. "I nearly lost everything I'd 3 days ago," she said, "and a man I'd never met stood in my door and wouldn't let them take it. I think I'd be a fool to let that same man ride away now, when I've finally got something worth keeping him for." He kissed her then, gently, the way a man kisses something he has decided, at long last, he means to keep safe for the whole of his life, and behind them the house that had so nearly been stolen stood warm and lit against the coming dark. No longer a widow's lonely burden, but the first true home either of them had claimed in a great many hard years. Nash sold his pistols to a gunsmith in the next county that winter, keeping only the rifle for game and predators, and took up carpentry instead, mending fences and raising a new porch rail for the house he now shared with Cora as husband and wife. Grey Rock talked for a season about the gunslinger who'd stayed, about a hired gun-turned homesteader for the love of a widow with a tin box of receipts, but Cora only smiled when she heard it, and said that some men were worth every word the gossips could spare, and considerably more besides. She kept the forged note, cleared and countersigned by the judge, folded inside the same tin box, not as a wound any longer, but as a reminder of the door a stranger had once refused to let anyone pass through unwelcome.